Recording now. The aim of this webinar is to empower educators with content and strategies to introduce Palestine into your courses. After introducing ourselves, we will provide sample lesson plans to provide an overview, as well as address specific subjects, music, dance, and theater, and specific issues, erasure, censorship, bias and power dynamics, among others. We will then shift into strategies for teaching contested issues in the classroom that recognize and work with discomfort among students and educators. We will open for a discussion at the end and are happy to spill over past the hour for those who are able to stay with us longer. Before we introduce ourselves, we wish to acknowledge that this webinar is taking place during a period of unceasing violence against Palestinians, especially Gazans. We would like to take a moment of silence to recognize the loss of life, shelter, and dignity experienced by Palestinians. Thank you. My name is Shayna Silverstein, and I will be serving in the roles of facilitator and educator in today's webinar. By way of introduction and what brings me here today, I identify as a Jewish and Chinese American. I feel connected to Palestine as an academic who has conducted fieldwork in Syria and Lebanon, where I met many Palestinians whose families fled Palestine in 1948, as well as many Arabs sympathetic to Palestinian liberation. I am also privileged to share many professional artistic spaces with those of Palestinian descent. These experiences inform the perspective that I bring to my classroom. Thank you.
So my name is David McDonald. I'm a professor of folklore and ethnomusicology at Indiana University. I'm here today based on 20 years fieldwork experience working alongside Palestinian refugee communities in Israel, in West Bank, in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and in North America. The work that I do is specifically engaged with Palestinian activism and the way in which expressive cultural practices engage with and attempt to transcend the various forms of oppression that Palestinians experience. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Holton, and I'm serving as an educator today, particularly regarding the trauma-informed practices in the classroom. I'm a specialist in North African music traditions. I mainly work with communities of musicians and educators in Tunisia and Libya. And from the beginning of my experiences in these countries, starting in 2008, one of the first questions my collaborators would ask me was, do you support Palestine? I quickly learned from that an orientation to the Palestinian struggle for land, rights, and dignity was a major backdrop to my presence as a white Euro-American man in North Africa, working with majority Arab populations. So I've continued to learn since 2008 from my collaborators, and I'm learning a lot from the collaborators here in this panel about this orientation. I have taught lessons on Palestinian topics, and I also direct and perform music, Palestinian music, whenever I can.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Salmon. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. My work studies Palestinian storytelling traditions, a mix of folkloric and personal storytelling. And the research that I do focuses on how these storytelling traditions contribute to Palestinian cultural resistance and a sense of community. I don't have any heritage or ancestry that ties me to Palestine, but I started doing this work out of interest in the cultural practices. And then the more that I learned, I'm much more driven by ethical commitments now. And after having had the chance to live with very dear friends in Palestine now, last year, I am connected by very, very, like I said, dear friendships. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Before we proceed, I want to make a few quick notes regarding how this webinar will be moderated. We encourage your participation through the Q&A portal. This will be moderated by Society for Arab Music Research co-chair Anne Elise Thomas, who's on the call with us today. Please note that the chat function is disabled, although we as the organizers are able to communicate with you to the chat. You are not able to enter messages into the chat. Please use the Q&A function for that. You have two options for how to participate in the Q&A. You can post questions under your name, or you can post questions anonymously. Please click the box to post anonymously. We request that all attendees and participants maintain respect and civility for one another and for those affected by the enduring conflict during this session. We will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event and will make use of the moderating functions on an as-needed basis to maintain those objectives of respect and civility. Thank you. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to the public. We realize that this may affect how you wish to post and participate, whether anonymously or in your name. For those interested in resources to help assess circumstances of free speech and academic freedom, we can direct you to resources available on the Middle East Studies Association page called Campus Climate Resources. I now turn to Jared, who will guide us through tools for trauma-aware teaching.
Thank you, Shayna. So teaching on Palestine certainly has its own specialized challenges and historicized approaches in North American classrooms. And more towards the end of this session, experienced speakers who are engaging Palestinian topics regularly in the classroom will share their top tips for how to respond to these particular challenges. But our panel also felt the need to recognize that teaching on Palestine is akin to teaching on other challenging topics in the classroom, topics that instructors and students alike perceive as difficult or contested or highly charged. The broader area of trauma-informed pedagogy represents researched practices that help instructors not only lead active learning classrooms, but do so by understanding the added layer of trauma effects on student life and learning. And I'd like to briefly share a few points and resources that I've curated on the topic recently. I also want to say that I trust that many of you already have teaching practices for leading discussions on difficult or contested topics, and some of you may have deep knowledge of trauma-informed teaching tips, and please consider sharing these in the chat. So traumatic experiences, in short, are experiences that harm both physically and emotionally and have lasting effects on the functioning of an individual. Trauma has lasting adverse effects that interrupt and interfere with one's life, and in this case, can affect a student's ability to learn based on how the brain is shaped and trained in response to traumatic events. You may already know that the prevalence of trauma among post-secondary students is very high today. I pulled a few statistics from the resources that I've included in the shared folder on this topic that you all have access to. One of these, two of these I find to be very strong. By the time our students reach college, 66 to 85% of them report lifetime traumatic event exposure, with many reporting multiple exposures. And even during undergraduate years, 66 to 94% of students report exposure to one or more traumatic events. So simply put, trauma is very present with our students emotionally and physically when they first enter our classrooms, and these effects can inhibit learning. Trauma is not just individually based. It's important to note in a session like this that trauma can be transmitted historically across generations. Past traumatic events from decades ago or from an entirely different geographic region can have direct and vicarious effects upon our students. For example, and specifically to our topic, Palestinian and or Arab background students today can carry the effects of family trauma from the 1948 Nakba or catastrophe. Jewish students can carry the effects of family trauma from the Shoah or the Holocaust, also from the 1940s. And even if we do not have Jewish, Arab, or Middle Eastern background students in our classes, students in the United States have viewed disturbing media on these catastrophes, or they're related by marriage to folks directly affected by the conflicts, or they certainly have absorbed certain mainstream narratives that confuse, distort, and misrepresent the catastrophes. And these are stressors that affect one's learning. So leaning into trauma-informed pedagogy builds classroom environments that are conducive to learning for all students. I want to draw attention to two academics and two licensed social workers, Janice Carello and Lisa Butler. They have written quite a bit on trauma-informed teaching around 5 principles that they foreground. One is ensuring safety. 2, establishing trustworthiness. 3, maximizing choice. 4, maximizing collaboration. And 5, prioritizing student empowerment. So again, they have written on trauma-informed teaching. This article is included in the folder, foregrounding 5 principles. Just to repeat again, 1, ensuring safety. 2, establishing trustworthiness. 3, maximizing student choice. 4, maximizing student collaboration. And 5, prioritizing student empowerment. And of all of these 5 principles, they say when they talk to students for the research, the students say that ensuring safety is the most important component of these 5. So ensuring the emotional safety and physical safety in the classroom is critical to being able to teach on topics perceived as difficult and contested and challenging. I've read a lot of things recently, and I'm so in this last minute, I'd just like to give sort of 3 areas that can give us some specific techniques from trauma-informed pedagogy that I think will apply to our session today. 1, being transparent in all communication, communicating goals and objectives from the start, as we've attempted to do in this session, from the start of the course, from the syllabus, from the start of the unit, if Palestinian teaching is happening in the midst of a unit, and from the start of the class, the discussion itself, being clear about your expectations for students and for their work during the discussion is really important. 2, to give attention to the physical spaces in the room. Because trauma resides in the body, there can be physiological reactions when triggered. So noting where entrances and exits are, for example, in the space, if students don't know, or where bathrooms are if they need to leave, is an important mark. You might even want to say the phrase, if you need to step out of the room, at the beginning of a discussion. That gives students the ability to leave if there is a physical response. If you take attendance, you might consider allowing an additional excused absence without needing to give a reason, and also providing campus and community resources to students at the end of a discussion, and some sort of central accessible slide, e-forum, or handout is also recommended. The third and last sort of node here is to provide pathways for student agency during learning. And I'd note that this is a central tenet of active learning in general, but trauma-informed pedagogy really adds another layer of importance on top of these tasks, like setting work that is collaborative, frequent small group discussions, setting out free writing tasks. All of these tasks enable students to give feedback and agency in these sort of critical conversations here. And I invite you to download the documents I've included in the folder and peruse them. They're available to you and in the link that we'll give you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jared. Now we'll shift into the curriculum content portion of the webinar. Guiding our path is David McDonald, who will provide an overview on teaching Palestinian music and dance.
Thank you, Shayna. So when we were putting together this webinar, one of the main obstacles we encountered was the reason why so many higher education professors, teachers have avoided incorporating Palestine into their syllabi was a large feeling of, I don't know enough. I don't know enough about this topic in order to feel comfortable teaching it. And so one of the things we're trying to confront here is that knowledge gap or the learning curve, or to at least provide support and encouragement to educators that this is a topic that absolutely needs to be incorporated into our syllabi. And what we can do to help support and encourage that work is what we've done is curated a folder, which everyone in this event will be given access to, where we have created lesson plans with requisite readings and other AV materials for how to teach specific topics in Palestine, Palestinian arts, Palestinian music and dance. And what I'll do is talk us through a couple of the ones that I have submitted. If you allow me to share my screen real quick. This is the folder that you'll notice available to everyone. I have submitted 4 different lesson plans for use. You're welcome to adopt them, revise them, or ignore them, whatever you find most useful for your particular needs. The first lesson plan up here is basically a general overview of Palestine and Palestinian history. Now, this is probably the trickiest, or at least the most challenging lecture of a unit on Palestinian music and dance. And so it requires perhaps the most engaged teaching approach. If you click on that folder, here's the sample lesson plan that is available. What you have here is this particular lesson plan is geared towards a undergraduate audience, a general large lecture, large enrolling lecture, a general world music survey, where you might consider introducing Palestine and Palestinian music. My learning outcomes are right here for you to look through. And then for each of these, I have links that are easily downloadable for you to use in your teaching that I have found useful in the classroom. I've been teaching this topic for about 15 years now. And each time I do it, I learn and revise and take a new approach because it's always an evolving topic and you're always in interaction and encounter with your students and the previous knowledge that they come to the classroom with. In this instance, for general undergraduate students, I've found that the Palestine 101 articles are very quick reads. They're very accessible for undergraduates, and they encapsulate the 20th century history of Palestine really up until the present in a way that undergraduates can grasp what's going on. The links are there, and historically it's been vetted and is based on the literature with citations. If you are uncomfortable using an online source such as Palestine 101, then I have here 2 books that are considered to be among the most well-researched studies of Palestinian history. Rashid Khalidi's The 100 Years' War on Palestine and Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. They both largely present the same material, but I found that, interestingly enough, my students are far more receptive to Ilan Pappé because he is an Israeli Jew writing from that perspective, and Rashid Khalidi is, in some instances, my students think is biased because of his Palestinian ancestry. That's another topic for conversation with your students. But both of these sources are really important historical texts that will provide you with a more in-depth academic scholarly history for you to use. This link right here is a text that is forthcoming in the Routledge Handbook on Palestine, where it provides a general overview of Palestinian music, just a real quick run through the last 100 years of the most important artists, time periods, cultural influences, albums, those kinds of things. It's a really great introduction to get you started if you have no previous experience with Palestinian music. And then I also ask my students to watch this brief animated history of the question of Palestine. It's a really quick 4-minute video created by the United Nations, specifically on Palestinian issues. If I click on these, you can see what we're talking about here. This is the Decolonize Palestine page, and here's Palestine 101. There's 5 articles here. I have my undergraduates read selections from them, depending upon the workload that I'd like to have them do. Likewise, click here. This is the forthcoming manuscript of an overview of Palestinian music, certainly available for you to use. And then finally, I have here the goals of each lecture, broken down into its various sections. Giving a contextualized history of Palestine is absolutely essential. And that means operating from a point of understanding the various narratives that are attached to the actual events. So, understanding that the question of Palestine emerges long before 1948, long before there was all of these problems that we've been watching recently, and understanding how the contested nature of Palestine has been at issue since at least the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1917. I then go through, here, let me just show you the slides I've curated. That might actually be a good way to do it. I've curated this slide deck for you to use. These are not my slides. These are visual slides that I've pulled from various organizations. For example, the Palestinian Youth Movement, Palestine 101. It has excellent maps with discussions of the various ways in which this piece of land following World War I was promised to 3 different political entities, and then how that led to the Palestinian question that we discussed today. Including the partition plan of 1947, the Plan Dalit, which was basically the eradication or the ethnic cleansing of what later became 1948 Israel from its native Palestinian population, the Nakba, and how the Nakba is discussed or interpreted based on one's positionality. This is an important point in the lecture where it's important to point out that the Nakba is the catastrophe for Palestinians, but for many Israeli Jews, it is also the redemption of a national project. And seeing how those 2 different narratives are born of the same historical event is an incredibly important lesson that you need to bring into the classroom that I found. Likewise, we get into the colonization of Palestine, based in its various history, how Palestinian agency and autonomy has been thwarted through settler colonialism, and then finally the ways in which the current area that we call Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip are administered differentially by Jewish Israelis, Palestinians, and those of various level of access and mobility in Palestine. Now, this is also, in my opinion, a really important point to dwell on, because one of the things that I find extremely important, if not essential, is to push back against this homogenized notion of Israel and Palestine, and rather to push past that dual state model and understand the intersectional and heterogeneous experiences within each of those categories, Israel and Palestine. And so this is the cornerstone of my teaching in Palestine, is to basically point out that the Palestinian experience is not homogenous, that it is not shared among all Palestinians, but rather Palestinian citizens of Israel, those who live in East Jerusalem, those who live in the West Bank, those who live in the Gaza Strip, and those who live in exile, all have differential experiences of oppression, differential and intersectional experiences of violence, and therefore need to be approached differently so that we don't fall into the trap of homogenizing, flattening, or essentializing Palestine as one particular people or experience. I'll get to that in a second. And then likewise, at the end of this lecture, I'll talk about how the current administration of the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli military occupation exacerbates the differential experience, the differential violences that are inflicted upon Palestinians. Okay, now, if I move back towards the folder, forgive me one second. My other lesson plans that I have included here all reinforce that same position of trying to approach Palestine through differential forms of oppression. And so I've included one particular lesson plan here that focuses on Palestinian citizens of Israel, colloquially termed 48s, and the way that hip hop has been traditionally used to articulate that very specific Palestinian positionality. I have another lesson plan here specifically on Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and their efforts to use popular music festivals as a form of direct activism against the occupation. And then I also have a lesson plan here specifically on Palestinians in exile, transnational Palestinian activists, as I call them, and particularly the engagement with gendered violence, or what is colloquially termed honor killings within Palestinian society. Each of these lesson plans are geared to approach Palestine through a specific form of oppression. And only the first one is simply about kind of the settler colonial impact of 1948 and its legacies. The others seek out understanding oppressions that form within Palestinian culture and society to show how they are differentially exposed, differentially vulnerable, and how each of these communities use music and the arts to confront, challenge, and hopefully transcend those forms of oppression, either through hip hop, either through featured film, cinema, or either through festivals, music festivals. Now, each of these lesson plans, I have included links to all of the media that you would need to teach, all of it freely available online. All you have to do is click on these links and you can immediately see the audio-visual aspects of what I'm discussing in the lesson plans. The readings also carefully tack with those audio-video clips for you to use. The whole point of that is to give higher education teachers the exact materials to make it as easy as possible for you to hone in on exactly how to do this work that challenges the dual state model, that allows for understanding Palestinian experience through differential forms of oppression and violence, and for facilitating more deep conversations with your students about the intersectional ways in which violence is experienced in this part of the world. With that, I will turn this over to my colleagues for their lesson plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, let me share my screen as well and show you another lesson that I have taught. I want to thank Dr. Liza Monk, who's with us in the webinar. We collaborated on this together. She's the one who first introduced me to these sources, and we've both taught these in our classes. So thank you, Liza. This is a lesson particularly on alternative music, space, and negotiating identities. It's a lesson for classes that seek to investigate expressive culture, power, identity within multiple zones of contact. This is not a historical lesson. This is very much looking at the effects of history and how geographical borders have complicated the lives of Palestinian musicians as they move about. Those that are performing in alternative music genres like trance, hip hop, EDMCs, just to be short about it. So two of the main sources that we have highlighted, one is a documentary that's accessible on YouTube by Boiler Room from 2018, Palestine Underground, Hip Hop, Trap, and Techno. And it features a number of musicians that are involved in the scene, and then reading this scholarly article by Nadim Karkabi, who teaches at the University of Haifa in the Department of Anthropology, Staging Particular Difference, Politics of Space, and the Palestinian Alternative Music Scene. So I encourage you to think about sort of the things that you're teaching this semester and the classes you're teaching in the fall, where you might be able to put this case study, what sort of unit this might fit within, because it's very flexible and can fit within a number of different contexts, like a global popular music class or any class that investigates music, performance, and politics. This lesson will bring students into contact mainly with Palestinian musician lives, again, as they overcome those institutionalized geographic barriers that have isolated them from their musical communities and made musical activities such as going to a rave or going to a musical event difficult and indeed dangerous. I find this lesson to be very effective with students in the United States, mainly because students that I teach often take a lot of these musical participation and activities for granted. So this really gets them to think about the simple activities, quote unquote, of making music and meeting up to listen to music, and really problematizing how difficult it is and how many barriers Palestinian musicians have to cross in order to do those activities. The case study from the documentary and Nadim Karkabi's article They are the main sources for the lesson. They really demonstrate that alternative music spaces become opportunities for celebration of expression and perseverance amidst these challenges of border crossing. Liza and I wrote this lesson plan for 1 to 2 undergraduate classes over a week, but we've also included a number of extensions here, and all of these materials are here with the extensions, and I'll go down to the bottom where we talk a little bit more about the extensions. So in other words, you could take the basic material of this course and run it through 1 or 2 lessons within a unit, but you could also extend this to include DJ Sama Abdulhadi, who is featured in the documentary. There has been a new publication about her, which is excellent, that shows the effects of that documentary that she was featured in, and then how she's living her life now. Also extending it to talk about Palestinian displacement, survival, gender, and Palestinian music. And I want to echo what Davey was saying about exploring the diversity within Palestinian communities and how that influenced cultural production and their connection and their sense of identity, and also a sense of religiosity in the region. We've listed a few of these possibilities here. Also for a graduate class, extending to a graduate class education. So Nadim Karkabi uses both Foucault's article Of Other Spaces and Bell Hook's book, Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics, both excellent sources to think more deeply about frames of placemaking, reassessments of place, or expressions of gendered social difference. Foucault's article Of Other Spaces and Heterotopia fits really nicely with graduate classes. Bell Hook's book, Karkabi uses this book to think about marginality as a dynamic space of, quote, radical openness to difference. All of these that can be explored further in graduate classes with other sources as well. I'm going to finish there. This resource that Liza and I wrote is included in our folder, along with the sources, Nadim Karkabi's source, and I think one other source. And then these links all will take you to the electronic space you need to access that material.
Okay, I will go ahead and share my lesson plan as well. Thank you, Jared. Give me 1 second here. So this lesson plan starts by discussing censorship and violence, and then sort of works through applying those concepts to Palestinian cultural production, focusing explicitly on Debka, and Debka performed by El Funun, which is a very famous and important cultural organization, Debka troupe in Palestine. So the way that this lecture is organized is we start with focusing on the conceptual and asking students to really dig into their preconceptions of what censorship is and what violence is. The goal here is that as we talk about Palestine, and part of what Jared was discussing earlier with trauma-informed pedagogy is that it's important to give students the space to express their opinions, express their thoughts in a way that doesn't limit them, but also maintains a safe space for the entire classroom. So, part of my screen is blocked. I hope everyone can see.
Whatever you're doing is working.
Okay, great.
The blocks are disappearing.
Okay. So we begin by talking through an article that I assigned ahead of time from 972 Mag, which is a publication from within Israel that includes Israeli and Palestinian writers. So this discusses the Palestinian Debka and addresses the issue of censorship with the Debka. I asked them to watch a video of one of El Fanoun's performances and then submit what kind of questions that those materials prompted for them. And then when they come in, they break into small groups and talk about what censorship means within that 972 mag article. But a lot of this lecture is designed around small group discussion. So it really depends on your sense of the class, how well they've sort of prepared for discussions about these kinds of things, where, as somebody in the Q&A mentioned, like terminology itself can be quite contested. So if you feel that the small group discussion is not feasible at this point in your class, then you can ask them to journal and submit their thoughts via Canvas. The point is that they're able to express their responses to these questions in a way that maintains the safety of the space. So once they talk about censorship specifically in relation to that article, then we talk as a class about how we might define censorship, what examples of censorship they might be able to name, and then the question of violence. How might we define violence? We talk about different types of violence. And then just to sort of bring us back out of the nitty-gritty into the fundamentals, we talk about the actual issues at stake are questions of humanity that whenever people need to justify violence and censorship, often what's at play here is a logic that there's a difference in the humanity between different groups of people, right? So that's just to help sort of pull people back out. And then one more small group discussion, which is to ask students to think about whether censorship is violence, when it is violence, when censorship is necessary, if it's ever necessary, why, to be able to argue those things clearly and with like evidence to pull from the discussions that we've already been having. So I will just share now my slides with you all. From there, only after all of this conceptual discussion is it useful to, only after all this conceptual discussion is it useful to start talking about Palestine in particular. So then you can start discussing examples of censorship as it happens in Palestine, which leads us to the question of Debka. Then talking about Debka is an opportunity to discuss the details of this cultural practice, the musical features, the dancing, the storytelling that's involved, the history of El Fanoun as both a Debka troupe and as a troupe that's attached to the Palestinian Art Center, which is very involved in documentation and preservation of folkloric practices, and El Fanoun's philosophy of combining sort of the traditional and the innovation, tradition and creation into their performances. This allows us to then talk about what cultural resistance is in the Palestinian context and the role of cultural resistance in particular in questions of censorship. So looking at these videos of Debka performances gives an opportunity to talk about a lot of different things. It gets us into styles of Arabic music. It gets us into styles of Arabic dancing. It gets us into the history of politicization of particular symbols by looking at the lyrics that are involved here. Here, I can pull up my slides here. So I've included 2 videos in the slides, along with the lyrics of the songs that are used in both of the videos, and a short discussion of some of that symbology in the lesson plan. And then after all of that discussion, we can talk about the way that the Israeli military interacted with Debka troops and dancers. And then I end this lecture by giving the question back to the students to discuss about whether or not this example is an example of censorship, and to give their reasoning for why based on what we've talked about throughout the lecture. As I wrap up, I say that censorship is a form of psychological violence because it prevents expression. It makes it so that certain voices are inaudible, invisible in particular spaces, and that DEBCA is, as an example of cultural resistance, is a way of countering that. So the goal of this lecture is to sort of ask students to pick apart their definitions and understandings of censorship and violence, to introduce the concept of cultural resistance, to practice identifying features of Arabic musical styles, such as DEBCA, and to apply those concepts to this particular practice. And now I will hand it over to Shayna. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. That was marvelous. Hello, everybody. So I want to speak about a lesson plan that addresses biases and perspectives. I also want to acknowledge there's several questions in the Q&A that are asking this. And as soon as I wrap up, we will then turn to the next portion of the webinar, which is dedicated to addressing these. And we have some tips and strategies from people who have been teaching this for over 10 years. So hold on, we'll get there. And so about biases and perspectives, as I begin to share screen, let me just say that two of the kind of overarching learning objectives that I have that are present in this lesson plan is the first, that I want students to be able to identify biases vis-a-vis an external text. So that's both a documentary film and newspaper articles about a specific event. All of them center around the same subject and topic, but they're both two different forms of media or communication that are all biased. And so students can therefore identify and externalize bias as opposed to trying to present their own specific biases or look at one another as biased. We all are, however, we need to learn how to manage them in the classroom to facilitate a dialogue, right? I also want to complicate the bias by not introducing something which forms the kind of binary of Israeli versus Palestinian, Zionist, anti-Zionist, and so forth, but see that these are very multivalent and can go many directions. And I know I said two, but I usually always have an additional point, which is that students themselves participate in the performance and production of bias. I specifically teach in a performance studies classroom, and what that means in terms of performance studies pedagogy is that we often try and activate students to become actors in what is going on as opposed to spectators, so they get involved. And now I turn to the specific lesson plan here, which is about Freedom Theater based in Jenin, and through two different angles. The first is to watch a documentary film called Arna's Children. So I assign the film as a previewing that I expect students to come into class having viewed. And then the second part of it is that they work with comparative newspaper accounts of the 2012 Battle of Jenin, published by the newspapers, the BBC, and the Haaretz. So there's a number of different learning outcomes that come out of this one class session, but I want to, and you can browse those on your own time whenever we circulate these resources after the webinar has closed. Within each of the different segments, basically the first half of the course is dedicated to discussing the film. And this is kind of a traditional seminar discussion. Usually the course that I teach it in is small enough that we can all kind of sit around a circle and talk amongst one another. So I set the frame for an open and considerate space for discussion. I also share my background and how I come to approach the conflict, and try to be transparent about biases as well as any sort of pivots and transformations that I have experienced, but at the same time also centering student perspectives. In other words, setting examples so that people can be transparent, but noting that this is mostly for them. I do a little bit of work of situating Arna's children in the context in which it was produced. That is, it talks about when Janine Theater was established in the late 1990s, and when the film was produced during the Second Intifada. So for those of you who might be spending only one session or 1 week on Palestine in a course that's otherwise devoted to, for instance, topics in the arts and humanities, this is, that brief situating of the context is a way to kind of get into it, even though you may not have had a lot of time to build up to it. And that is also a dynamic that we will address shortly. And I also pay attention to the affective responses that emerge during the discussion, which is to bring into discussion how students feel in their bodies and in their emotions, what the film does. This helps to acknowledge that our bodies are present in the learning environment, which is especially important whenever we're thinking about issues that may or may not tap into embodied traumas, excuse me. And the second part then, after we kind of wrap up the discussion, I've give you some different talking points on discussing Arna's children, is to introduce Augusto Boal's newspaper theater. Newspaper theater is entirely separate from Palestine. Boal is Brazilian, but is a common technique that is used in performance studies classroom. Very briefly, Boal tries to work with the participant and spectator relationship in order to make the spectators active participants in wrestling with power dynamics and political events. And so this becomes very apropos and relevant to the topics in Arna's children and generally to discussing the conflict and occupation. So there are a number of different techniques that fall under newspaper theater. And there are some sources here that you can use to review when you're preparing for the lesson, should you choose to use it. I introduce Boal's newspaper theater techniques to the students. Then I ask them to take each of the 2 newspaper articles, which are both fairly brief, and work together and find ways to read or perform the newspaper article using one of the 12 newspaper techniques that we have just looked at in class. And there's techniques such as alternating who reads a text, figuring out a sort of rhythm, or figuring out a sort of stress, and amongst others. And then each of the groups go around and perform the newspaper. Out of this, it becomes very apparent. First of all, students have to take a close-up view of the newspaper article because they are working with it, right? They're trying to interpret it and adapt it. Second of all, when they are then juxtaposed to each other, the bias between the newspaper articles comes forward. I should also mention that in Arna's Children, there's a number of different ways in which the characters in the film, the documentary characters, also hold their own biases, and that comes up often in discussion. Those, and then we leave some time at the end for students to then reflect on what occurred during the use of newspaper theater, and as well as the class as a whole. So thank you, and I'll turn it to Hannah, who will sum up what we are doing with our educational resources. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, again. Thank you, Shayna. I will do this quickly because the time is running. So for those of you who have not seen this before, we have been working to gather some educational resources on Palestine as resources that can help to prepare lectures and also just provide more understanding, contextualization for how to understand Palestinian cultural practices as part of Palestinian life, Palestinian politics, all kinds of things, and as well as preparing to teach. So we have several different kinds of resources. You can see we're divided into sections here. Within each of these sections are resources for varying purposes. Some of them are more useful for instructors to read as their own preparation. Some of them are really excellent as assignments for students. Each of the sections is divided into smaller sections as you scroll down. There are resources for discussing what Palestine is, with a specific set of resources about Gaza in response to the current escalation. In the question of heritage, there's a Cultural Heritage 101, as well as discussing issues such as cultural erasure and censorship and cultural resistance. We also, within these cultural heritage category, address folkloric repertoires as well as popular music repertoires and art and traditional repertoires. Within the section on occupation and conflict, we have information on cultural resistance to the occupation, artistic practices for negotiating the conflict, and the influences of the occupation and violence and the experience of trauma as a result of these things. All of these resources are related to both music and dance and other performance practices. There's a specific section on Islam, Islamist movements, Islamic interpretation and doctrine on music, as well as specifically relating to Hamas. We also address the practice of music and dance in particular in exile, migration, and diaspora. There is a list of really excellent books and theses in the ethnomusicology genre on Palestine, as well as a list of archives. I love this archive in particular. They have all kinds of things. You know, I work on storytelling. They have digitized the notes from some of the folklorists who did this research on storytelling in the 70s and 80s. It's really incredible. It's an incredible archive. A list of important songs, and finally, films and documentaries that can be useful for the classroom. And then finally, resources for the classroom for campus climates, addressing the phrase from the river to the sea, ensuring that your classroom has a healthy environment, and as well as the mental health resources in the Palestine Feminist Toolkit. A lot of the toolkits that existed long before what we've done here are listed in the first section. They're very, very useful. They're full of information. They've been edited since things started happening in Gaza. So there's all kinds of stuff here. We hope you find it useful. And if you have any questions about it, just let us know in the Q&A. I'll hand it back over to Shayna. Thanks.
Thank you. We realize that it is 54 minutes into the hour, and that some of you may need to go on the hour. We will keep going, and we are recording this webinar. So if you do need to go, rest assured that if you're registered, that you will receive a recording that will be circulated. With that said, we hope you will stay and participate in the Q&A. And we also would like to actively solicit additional lesson plans from you all. We are hardly the only people who are teaching. So if you do wish to share, you have something to contribute, please send it to the Society for Arab Music Research, and we will drop the email for SAMR into the chat. And we can provide further details about the process in the follow-up email at the end of this webinar. So now we're going to shift into the teaching strategies portion of our time together, a little bit more of the messy stuff. Just very quickly, I just want to, acknowledge, as Jared did in the beginning, that obviously this is a very vulnerable, very emotional, very political topic, which is why everyone is here today. And in particular, I think one of the emotions that is most dominant at the present is that of grief, and ways to address grief, both for individuals, for societies, as well as a greater sort of zeitgeist, is particularly significant and I think appreciated by people, no matter what their position or perspective on the ongoing conflict. Intergenerational trauma can inform, of course, everybody from their backgrounds, as well as those who are maybe a little bit more witnessing, feel a little more adjacent to what is going on, as opposed to more immediately part of. And people who are kind of caught in between and want to protect those who are in their friends and colleagues circuits, right? So maybe perhaps want to maintain a position of neutrality at the same time that they recognize that the conflict is a difficult and complex space. And finally, the emotion of outrage. Outrage is very mobilizing and very galvanizing. And we think it's important to recognize that it is also at play. For ways to kind of additional resources for thinking about where people are coming from. There are a number of resources that are not necessarily educational, but more kind of just social and out there. One that I personally would recommend is a podcast published by Jewish Currents called Talking to Our Families, which kind of gets at when different perspectives are shared within families and extended families. And the editors at Jewish Currents have some ideas or spaces of just kind of dialogue and conversation for what that might feel like. And that can be for people who both identify as Jewish as well as people who identify as non-Jewish and want to be cognizant of the vulnerabilities that are at stake. We also, recognize that there have been unprecedented and highly politicized attacks on free speech in academia and public discourse, and that universities may issue policies explicitly about Palestine, or there may be hidden forces that are exerting pressure. And we encourage you again to go to the MENA Campus Climate Resources page, as well as to Palestine Legal for any questions or issues that you may have. And thank you to those who have posted specific questions to the Q&A. What I want to move into now are some top tips for teaching the Palestine-Israel conflict. The tips that I will share now come from a colleague of mine, Wendy Perlman, who is a professor of political science and the Crown Professor of Middle East Studies at Northwestern University. She has 14 years experience of teaching the conflict, and these are, I'm about to share a screen, some tips that she generated specifically for this webinar. The first tip is to set the tone in the very first class. And even if your first class is not at all about the Middle East or Southwest Asia and North Africa, there's still, Palestine is not exceptional in the sense that it can be a trauma-aware space, right? There are many issues that tap into this. So setting the tone in the first class to frame a safe but challenging space, and a space where people are neither angry or afraid, where they are seen and recognized. One of the ways that I've done this in a class that is not about Palestine or the Middle East, but is about another area that people may have vulnerabilities towards, is I say, I don't know when I don't know, right? Even as the instructor, even as a pedagogical authority, even as a specialist, right? There are instances when I don't know, and that is an important way to actually, if you will, decolonize the classroom, to recognize how authority is distributed and knowledge is distributed. The second tip from Wendy Perlman is to set and reinforce the parameters. If the discussion starts to escalate, this is one of the questions in the Q&A, if the discussion starts to go off the rails, to trust that because of the way university classrooms are set up, you can redirect the discussion towards, for instance, Arnold's Children, the documentary film, right? Towards another teaching object that you either are going to discuss or you have discussed, to a reading. There is some formal parameters to a university classroom that can be your resource towards setting parameters on the discussion. The third is to move historically. As you noticed when we were introducing the lesson plans, it's exactly how we started out, right? When David McDonald offered the overview and the context. Moving historically helps to build historical layers. It helps to, students always come in with some sort of gap in their knowledge and their experience, and this can help to fill that gap wherever it may lie for any individual student. Moving step by step is very important. It also helps to present a kind of factual background that helps to establish yourself as an instructor who is fair and therefore your pedagogical legitimacy, as opposed to students perhaps dismissing you as biased in one way or another. And then the fourth tip is to balance the readings, right? Students will be coming from all perspectives. And if you can provide multiple perspectives on each historical period or each topic that you are presenting, that helps you to both recognize where students are at, which is very important to meet students where they're at, as well as for you to then push the envelope on certain topics so that there can be discomfort and there can be growth, which is what I think we are all trying to do when we are talking about this challenging subject in our classroom. We want students to grow and experience discomfort in the learning process and acknowledge that that is beneficial to everybody involved. One recommendation that Wendy Perlman has for balancing readings is she often uses a textbook called Arabs and Israelis, and we'll include this in the folder. It's triple written by Israeli, Palestinian, and Egyptian scholars. So it presents both Israeli, Palestinian, and Arab narratives for each historical period that it covers. It helps students to develop a holistic sense of multiple perspectives on each era. And it's not so much about both sidism as it is recognizing that, as we've also said throughout the seminar, that that is important to create a variegated landscape for what is going on here. Number 5, err on the more empirical or factual side rather than the theoretical side. And so when students raise questions, to answer it through facts rather than perhaps going into theoretical discussions about a particular concept or about a particular political theory. This helps students to resolve gaps or cognitive distances that they are working through. 6th is to build slowly to the most contested topic, and I think this can address one of the questions in the Q&A. Building slowly helps students to be able to address these topics from a more informed perspective rather than bringing in their fully emotional self, right? And an example that Wendy gives is that she is able to teach an entire course on the conflict, and she brings such contested issues as the executive summary provided by the Human Rights Watch, which charges Israel with apartheid, to the end of the quarter. There is, she could not effectively hold a discussion about that in the first class. She would not, I think, even use the word apartheid in the first class, but it's something that she can build towards, and again, moving historically. Similarly, Wendy Perlman raises the issue of boycott, divest, and sanction at the end of the term when students are ready for it and able to engage in a discussion. And finally, to reach students where they're at, to recognize, credit, and cheer them for being discomforted, for being vulnerable, and emphasizing that that's why they left their families to come to the university. That's why they are mingling with people who may be coming from different backgrounds at the university in general, and that this also happens in the classroom. Is to struggle personally is to be part of university life. And there's different ways to communicate this. It might happen one-on-one in sessions, office hours with students. It might also happen in the broader group class situation. And so it's a way to turn a negative of, oh, I feel so discomforted, into something which is not only just a positive, but a point of achievement. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you, Shayna. So I've also curated a list of top tips that I've found useful in teaching this topic over the last 15 years here at Indiana University. Some of them are very similar to Shayna's list, and others aren't. And so for that, I want to begin with a quote that one of my interlocutors told me in Palestine. This is a hip hop artist who had been imprisoned by the Israeli government many times, but had also been physically the subject of violence from Hamas for having a feminist approach and for performing hip hop. And his ultimate take, which he told me, was, he said, you know what, Davey, this crisis will end when it is no longer Jews versus Palestinians, but when Jews and Palestinians come together to end oppression. And that really hit home for me. And that became the orienting principle that I use in teaching this issue. I'm not teaching Palestine, I'm teaching oppression and anti-oppression, wherever that may be located. And that became an unlocking moment for me in the classroom. And it allowed me to feel a bit more flexible in how I approach this and to get at some of the nuances and differential experiences of Palestinian life that I alluded to earlier. So I focused the learning on documenting and confronting oppression, no different than I would any other area of the world. But these are the 5 tips that I came up with that I think you might find useful. And as I said before, you're welcome to use them, adopt them, or ignore them as becomes useful for your own teaching. The first is scaffold in theoretical concepts and ideas long before you get to Palestine. So in the 2 courses where I teach Palestine to undergraduates, one is the large lecture course, the general survey, and the other is one called Soundtrack to Revolution, which is basically a global survey of protest song. We approach settler colonialism long before we ever get to Palestine, largely through case studies on North America and indigenous populations, Native Americans, through gentrification and sound in Washington, D.C., and through land acknowledgements and the politics of recognizing indigenous histories and presence on land. I've already scaffolded in those concepts long before we ever get to talking about Palestine. That way, when I bring up settler colonialism, it is not a concept that necessarily causes an immediate reaction from the students, but one that they can associate with other situations. This is also true with talking about racial violence, vulnerability, positionality, Orientalism, representation, and otherness. If you scaffold in those concepts earlier, on topics that may not have an immediate reaction among your students, you've already equipped your students with the tools they will need to think about Israel-Palestine outside of their socialized viewpoints. Another point that I think is really important, and it came up in Shayna's list, was teach the readings, stick to the readings. Where conversations may venture far afield, always come back to the readings. Focus the discussions on the readings, have the students engage with the readings. And then you can get into notions of bias and positionality. You can get into the things that make academic or scholarly writing, the verisimilitude of it, as well as its veracity. You can get into those issues no different than you would any other academic text. Guys like peer review, things like going through citations and finding out which sources are legitimate and which are not. But if you stick with the readings, the conversation has less of a chance to get derailed. Number 3 is teach without imposing. And this is difficult because students will often think that no matter what you're saying, it comes from a place of bias. And this is where you have to assume a posture of inquiry and curiosity to students' opinions and experiences while continually focusing on the actual events, the readings, the scholarly literature, the things that can be verified, and clearly demarcate the difference between event and narrative. The facts that we know happened, and here's why we know they happened, and the narratives that emerged from that event. And if you can get students to understand the difference between those two things, they are stepping outside of their own personal socialization into this concept, and they're seeing it as an object of intellectual inquiry. In many ways, I found that helps students alleviate this accusation of bias, whether it's coming from me as instructor or coming from the materials that they are engaging with. And then this number 4 I get from my colleague, Dan Siegel, who wrote an amazing article on teaching Israel-Palestine in the classroom, and it's included in the folder, and I would really encourage you to download it and read it. And this was something he told me once that I found really important, and that's teach against the grain. You have to understand students already have a previous socialization into Israel-Palestine. Perhaps it's through personal religious experience. Perhaps it's from the media, from being subjected to the ways in which Israel-Palestine has been communicated in North America through the media. But in each one of those situations, you're going to have to teach against that socialization. And that means being really open to understanding the diverse socializations of the issue, but also moving students towards an understanding of the crisis that departs from those representations. And but by that, I mean moving against the dominant narrative or the mainstream narrative that sees this as a symmetrical conflict, as two nation states warring over a land based on primordial enmities that go back centuries. And instead pushing the students to see this as an example of a crisis of systematic oppression through settler colonialism and enabled through overwhelming superiority, funded by and supported by the US government. And then finally, this is the most important, but perhaps the most difficult, and that is refuse the binaries. The way in which Israel-Palestine has been typically presented is through three prominent discourses. The first discourse is one I've already alluded to, the dual state model that sees two nation states warring against each other, the either or mentality, Israel, Palestine. The second discourse is one of Islamic terrorism, which has been rooted in this country's media for a very long time, at least the last 25 years, and certainly has a way of interpreting or shading the way people are socialized into seeing the Israel-Palestine crisis through the idea of the criminality of Palestinians and the larger violent nature of Islam and its engagement with the non-Islamic world. And then the last discourse is one of Jewish vulnerability, one that sees or legitimizes the settler colonial practices of the Israeli government through a reaction to a feeling of vulnerability, Jewish vulnerability in the world. And that legitimation of the occupation and what's currently happening is one of the most dominant ways in which Israel-Palestine is presented to our students before they even get into the classroom. What I'm asking you to do is to refuse the binaries at the heart of each of these three discourses and push students to see the oppression rather than the binary. And that is a difficult task. In the classroom, we need to identify and deconstruct the animating discourses that inform these binaries. We need to instead push forward through them and seek out the relational, interconnected, and integrated identities of those who live in this area we call Israel-Palestine, and see the various forms of oppression and vulnerability that inflict all of these people in this area. If we focus on the oppression and the differential forms of exposure, all of a sudden we've found a way to circumvent the binaries of the dual state model, Islamic terrorism, and Jewish vulnerability. For me, this is a really great way popular culture, music, performance allows us the facility to see those interconnections, to see the relational identities at play, and to dial in on very specific intersectionally informed forms of violence and oppression in Israel-Palestine. I hope these are useful to you all. I would certainly be open to anyone who has suggestions of their own. I'm always looking for new ways of teaching this material. And if you found something that works for you, I would encourage you to please get in touch with us so that we can share it with others and so that many people can benefit from it. And with that, I'll pass things back to Shayna.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So it is now 2:15 Eastern Standard Time. And we recognize that some people may go and need to go. And thank you. And we wish you farewell. We really appreciate that you're able to join us. For those who are able to stay, and we encourage you to stay, we are now able to address some of the questions in the Q&A, as well as open it up for discussion, because we know that you all have experiences and have perspectives that we can all draw on. And if you would like to also tackle some of the questions in the Q&A, we welcome a more open-ended discussion and dialogue. So if we kind of move, I think, from the top question, the first question that was posed, and go through it. I'll read aloud the questions and then welcome anybody to offer a response. The first is, can we all speak to de-escalation in the classroom, especially where basic components such as terminology or even historical timeline might either meet resistance or explicit refusal? I think this question was addressed in our tips and strategies, which is to set parameters and to use the pedagogical objects, the historical context, the particular cultural works that you're discussing, to use those to help to de-escalate. So I hope that question has been addressed, and please feel free to post again if there's a more specific way that you would like us to respond to that question. The second question is, how do you choose accurate maps? I know many Jewish and Israeli peers use sources that compare land and context to the Arab League, for example. I think that the question of sort of empirical truth is one of the most contested processes, and that part of the classroom is not necessarily to establish what is fact and what is truth, but to unpack the processes by which we in the classroom and those in the world at large try to create the stories that enable truth making and truth telling. So I wouldn't, as an instructor, wouldn't turn to specific map for its accuracy, but rather choose at least 2, if not 3 maps that are juxtaposed to each other in ways that tell a story, and then ask students to identify what that story is and analyze it. I welcome anybody else's thoughts about that. Okay, thanks. The next question is to address extreme tension. I think we have tried to, and specifically dialogue between Zionist and non-Zionist positions, or the tension between Israelis in the room and Palestinians in the room. Students have all these positions, and how do we negotiate that? For example, some students will not want to read Papa and Khalidi without some other text and counter dialogue. One of the ways that I suggested in my lesson plan is to avoid binaries. There are students who have no direct experience, who have no affective experience, and who have no kinship to the region, who are strongly persuaded into a particular political direction. And they will make that evident through body gestures as well as through speech communication. Right. So it's not just maybe about nationality or about ethnicity or about religion, but people come in with a number of different factors that influence their perspective. And I think what we've tried to emphasize, and and I again completely open up the floor to everybody else, is to create a complexity and dissonance or gaps between any given perspective, so that we can begin to show how they dissolve in the light of history. Would anybody else like to respond?
I might add just one thing to that. That was a very excellent response, Shayna. The notion of how does Zionism factor into a conversation about Palestine is complicated. And I would like to think about this if we moved it to a different context. If we were talking about Black communities in the US, we want to make sure we don't center whiteness in our conversations of Blackness, and instead talk about the effects of whiteness rather than whiteness itself. The same thing factors here. In a lesson plan on Palestine, we have to be careful not to center Zionism, but rather to talk about Zionism's effects on Palestinians. And in that sense, you're moving the conversation, you're recentering the conversation away from one particular narrative to the exposure, the oppositions, the violences inflicted on through that same discourse. And so what I would caution folks in doing is think about teaching Zionism through its various valences. And in one particular valence, an undertaught valence, is its effect upon the indigenous population of Palestine.
Thank you. I'm going to combine our response to that question with actually the last question that is currently posted in the chat, because I think they go well together, which is how do you deal with students' desires to know your personal stance, either in the classroom or privately? The poster is a strong believer in a single state along the lines of Pape's stance, but do you advocate resisting being placed in a camp beyond a commitment to honesty and acknowledging oppression, common humanity, and the falsehood deficiency of many vigorously promoted narratives? I'm sure all of us have our own response. I'll go first since I'm holding the mic, proverbial mic. I try to frame and structure the classroom such that and as well as my own transparency, so that students do know where I'm coming from, but that my perspective is not the dominant perspective. And so I do not aggressively share my personal perspective and view in conversation and dialogue. It is in some ways present in the way that I've structured a lesson plan or structured the course, right? As well, for instance, one student, when I was teaching a contemporary Middle Eastern performance class, and he offered a class presentation that it clearly expressed a specific perspective on the conflict, right? And other students looked at me for a reaction because they were interpreting a gap between that student perspective and my perspective that they had picked up from our interactions. To the extent that I could, I did not give a specific kind of reaction, right? But approach the student's work in the way that it was presented, in the terms that it was presented. Because courses are building blocks, later, weeks later in the course, there was an opportunity for that perspective to be challenged. And actually through participatory newspaper theater, another student challenged the presenting student on their perspective in ways that opened up dialogue, opened up discomfort and vulnerability. And this all was able to happen between the students without me specifically inserting my perspective. And if other people have some comments to that question, please go ahead.
I'll say that one of the things that I think a lot about in my teaching is storytelling. So I research storytelling. Storytelling is part of my pedagogical approach to things. So I do share about experiences that I've had. I tell stories, and this is coming from work that's done by a team that they call themselves Arabia Feministas, working out of Arizona. There's an article by Manal Hamza et al. From 2020 that discusses this pedagogical approach using they're drawing on the history of testimonios and pláticas and comparing it to the Arabic terms shahada and haki. So I think it's important to share our personal experiences as teachers, to let storytelling to be a part of the academic space, which necessarily means an amount of self-disclosure, right? So I think that is there. But as Shayna was saying, like in the actual discussion about these topics in the classroom, like for the lesson plan I shared, I try not to direct people's opinions very much in the conversation about censorship and violence and how we might define it and apply it. So it's a tension, right? But anyway, that's what I have to add.
Thank you, Hannah. I'll move on to the next question. In addition to political points, would you be able to offer or discuss using historical context related to Palestine as a region, such as Byzantine music, Andalusian, Arabic, and Hebrew poetry and linguistic questions, Nur Masalha's Palestine, a 4,000-year history?
Sure. Yes, you could take the longue durée approach to studying the region and literally go back thousands of years, should you find that useful for your class. My approach is to take the contemporary moment and then try to disentangle what is particularly activated amongst the people in the region right now. And perhaps that is this centuries long interaction and engagement between various peoples in and out of the region, or perhaps it isn't. But my approach is, okay, let's talk about this particular moment and find out what is meaningful for the people in this area and what is currently being activated within this encounter. And if that includes that, absolutely. If it isn't, then I would focus on the things that are most relevant.
Thank you. I think this also ties into a later question that is asked. How do you address Israeli and Jewish student claims of indigeneity, claims that settler colonialism is impossible as the indigenous peoples, Jewish and Israeli ties to Native American and American Indian activism? This tension comes up the second colonialism is brought up.
Yes, absolutely it does. I think the best way of doing that is we have very clear statistics on Jewish immigration to the region beginning in 1897 with the British. And we have very clear statistics, and we can document specifically at what point in time from 1897 to the present, Jews immigrated to that area, where they immigrated from. And so that becomes a means of thinking through the settler colonialism issue, one rooted in what we have in terms of census data, and what can therefore be used to understand the large growing population of Jewish immigrants who came from areas for whom there was no indigenous connection to the area, and how that influx, how that immigration had an effect, a direct effect on the indigenous population. Now, you want to be very clear not to make these easy slides between situations in other settler colonial nations. You don't want to fall into the trap of saying this is South Africa, this is Australia, this is North America. But you do want to point out the unique historical contexts from which the term settler colonialism is being used as a heuristic to understand the situation.
Thank you. The next question is something that we have addressed in part, but that we can continue to speak about. It's a three-part question. Why might American researchers be interested in teaching about Palestine to their students? The second part we have addressed during classes on Palestine. Do you personally and emotionally engage, or do you prefer to remain neutral regarding the Palestinian cause? And third, do you encounter challenges with universities in addressing the topic of teaching about Palestine?
I think it's very clear this is an important issue, one that is perhaps the most important issue facing our political spectrum today. It's an issue that is, I think, importantly situated within the college classroom, where you would like to think we remain part of an unfettered space of inquiry and criticism. This is also probably the largest humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. These are all very clear, in my opinion, very clear demonstrations of why this should be part of our curriculum. Specifically, if we think about the US's role in all of this, it becomes absolutely essential that we educate, inform our students about their country and its practices. And this is one issue where I don't believe they are getting that information through mainstream channels, and requires critical discourse analysis. It requires reflection. It requires articulation with personal experience, but it also requires moving past the discourses that I explained earlier. And then finally, at my own campus at Indiana University, if you haven't heard, one of my colleagues was suspended for this semester and the next for pro-Palestinian advocacy, really. And we had an art exhibit by the great Samia Halaby canceled at the last moment because of security concerns. I guess they felt that exhibiting her paintings on campus posed a security risk to the campus population. In any case, each of those instances clearly demonstrate that on my campus, at least, there is a hostile, if not antagonistic, environment towards teaching Palestine in the classroom or learning about Palestine outside of the classroom. So yes, I do think campuses are becoming hostile to this topic, which in my opinion actually means we should be talking about it more.
And that is one of our aims in hosting this webinar, is to open up this kind of discussion for educators across universities and campuses. We have 2 more questions. If anybody is holding on to their question, please do put it in the chat because we will go ahead and close the webinar after the next 2 questions plus any additional that come in now. Thanks. Can we explicitly discuss binaries with students, as in how do we frame the discussion, or is it a matter of helping the students get to the point of refuting the binaries? For me, because I do not teach a course that is singularly devoted to this topic, right? It comes within a broader set of issues and subjects. My learning outcome is that students are able to identify the binaries across multiple works, multiple contexts, and multiple subject positions.
Refuting the binaries is actually easier than you think. When you take a look at Israeli society and its immense racial, cultural, social, political, economic diversity, it's very easy to point to students how this binary of Israel-Palestine completely falls apart. Especially when we point out that a lot of the pro-Palestinian activism, both in Israel and in the US, is led by Jews. So this decoupling of Judaism and a particular Israeli state policy is equally easy to demonstrate, thus refuting the binary. And you could do actually the same work among Palestinians, who are incredibly diverse in terms of their social, political, economic, religious approaches, identities, and feelings. And you can also dial in on how they are in many ways oppressed internally by a form of Islamic extremism, or I don't know if the word extremism is perfect, but Islamic patriarchy that then enforces Nakbas within Palestinian society. So one of the lessons that I presented here talks about the feminine Nakba, and that in many ways challenges this homogeneity of Palestine and says, okay, we need to not only focus on the occupation, but rather the occupation women feel within the home as a result of Islamic patriarchy. That is another way in which you can refute the binary of Palestine. So it's actually easier than you think. You just have to dig deep and notice and focus all of your attention on the oppression rather than on the concept of Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. And our final question is, David suggests the frame of oppression as a lens through which to approach the topic and avoid binaries. But it seems to the poster that oppression as a concept potentially introduces more binaries. The poster appreciates Hannah and Shayna's examples of narrative and storytelling based in particular people's experiences as a way to potentially exit binaries, if we acknowledge that probably all parties involved in all valences have felt oppressed, violated, traumatized.
Oppression is not specifically the property of one group or another. And if you are focusing on Palestinian culture and Palestinian forms of expressive cultural practice, then you would focus on those forms of oppression that are relevant to that particular topic. Should we want to also at the same time explore other forms of oppression within the region for other peoples, I'm all for it. In fact, our entire approach should be seeing, identifying, and transcending the oppression regardless of the people. And so what I'm advocating for here is certainly let's do that. Let's talk about the other forms of oppression that come up or that become reactive in this situation. And let's confront that as well. Let's find ways of transcending that as well. It's not a limited scope here. I'm not trying to assume that one group is oppressed and another isn't. I'm just saying if we focus on the oppression, we see the region in a different way.
I might also add that in the past few months since October 7th, the public discourse on oppression has been reconfigured and has shifted. For instance, Jewish Voices for Peace has claimed that Jewish oppression is linked to Palestinian oppression, and that for Jews to not feel oppressed, that can occur through the lifting of Palestinian occupation. And so even if we do approach oppression as a concept, as a political force, as a mobilizing the political sentiment, right? There are many social actors and political actors constellated around that concept that can, in many ways, defy the binary. And we have our final question, which is, do you define anti-Semitism at the top of the lesson?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I do not, because anti-Semitism is particularly it is a topic that deals with specific harm and traumas done to Jews for being Jews. And as this is a lecture on Palestinians, Palestinian culture and history, I wouldn't see the need to discuss anti-Semitism when I'm focusing on a group for whom that term is not connected.
I would add also that discussions of anti-Semitism and awareness of who is entering the classroom as a specific learning space fall into what Jared offered at the beginning of our lesson in terms of trauma-aware pedagogy, and recognizing that many different instances of hate or bias can occur because people bring themselves into the classroom. We can't divorce who we are from who we are in those formal settings, and such that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of racism are embedded in the society that we live in, which includes these learning spaces. So it is something to be aware of, and that is why we opened with the trauma-aware pedagogy and asking that people bring awareness to what they need in these spaces. Any final thoughts from our panelists? Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you to those of you who hung in there for over an hour and a half. We really appreciate your being with us today and sharing this space. And the Society for Arab Music Research will follow up with an email. And likewise, feel free to send an email and follow up to SAMR's Gmail email, which you should have from the chat. Goodbye.
Thank you all.